Hey, how's it going, guys? I want to start this video by giving out the brief outline of this tutorial. We'll start off with the base of the mud. Then we're going to add small and micro details. Continue by adding an extra oomph. And we'll finish it off with the Pebbles Creation and color map. I provided the timestamp of each section in the description down below. Feel free to skip ahead to the part that interests you. If you are not familiar with the controls, you can see what keystroke I'm pressing on the left-hand side. You know, sometimes we want to revisit a tip or a technique mentioned in tutorials. Having to go through the entire video and guessing where the one tiny part is can be very frustrating. That is why I created a PDF version of this tutorial. It allows you to browse through what you need quickly. I also added an extra tutorial about how I set up the render you saw at the beginning of the video. It can be very useful to you because rendering and lighting affect the outcome tremendously. If you have great material but a bad render, it will drastically decrease the quality of your work. I highly recommend you spend a little extra time on it. It'll be worth it. If you're interested in getting the PDF, click the link down in the description below. It also comes with the Substance file. Alright, with that being said, let's get started. Click on File, New Substance. For this project, I will be using one of the physically based graph templates provided for us. As you can see, there are two options. Unreal Engine uses metallic roughness, and CryEngine, Unity, and Marmoset Toolbag uses specular glossiness. Since I use Unreal Engine, I will choose the second option, metallic roughness. Let's give the graph a name, Icy Mud. There are two options for size mode. Absolute is for having a fixed resolution. If you want to change the resolution at any time, without losing the quality, you can use relative to parents instead. I will leave it as absolute. Change the resolution to 2048 pixel. And the format is for the figure of bits in each channel. I will leave it as it is. Click OK. Now you will see this mirror-like cube in the 3D view. And we don't want that. Let's give a color to the metallic and roughness map so we can adjust the values. Press Space or Tab to bring up the menu. Search Uni. Click on the first option, Uniform Color. This node allows you to specify a color. On the right panel, we have the option of color or grayscale. We only want black and white, so press Grayscale. The metallic map is for telling if the shader is metal or not. Let's plug this into the metallic output. You won't see a lot of changes, but black indicate non-metal and white is metal. Clearly, mud is not metal. We will leave it as black. Copy the uniform color for the roughness map. Roughness map is for showing the micro surface of the material. Black describes smooth and white is rough. Smoother surfaces' reflection will be more intense and focused. A rougher surface will appear larger and dimmer highlight. Alright, let's adjust this to a grayish color for now. Plug this into our roughness channel. The color of the preview is a bit dark right now. Let's copy the color input from roughness map and plug it into the base color output so that we can preview the object a little bit better. I always create a 2D transformation node to our normal map and height map for easy access. Let's hook this up. Now we have finished setting up our file. Let's start creating the height map. I want to point out that this is my process with this particular exercise. I try to use a different method or approach in every different project. You are more than welcome to follow along, but I highly recommend you to experiment with different noises and settings to fit your projects. I usually start by creating the base shapes of the ground first. So I'll choose a noise generator that is in a soft sense. Press space and type clouds. I will be using Clouds 2 for now. What I am going to do here is to blend two cloud nodes together. Let's bring in a histogram scan to control our map. connect our cloud output to the histogram scan's input. We need two of the histogram scan. Control-C, Control-V for copying and pasting. Double-click on the top of the histogram scans to bring up the properties. You will see our histogram scan is black at the moment. That is because the position and the contrast are set in 0 by default. The position is kind of like a brightness control. Contrast is pretty self-explanatory. It adjusts the contrast of the input and can be used to improve the hardness of the input's transition. Let's crank up our position to 0.5 and 0.11 for contrast. I will do the opposite for the other histogram scan. I'm going to darken it a little bit here. Set the position to 0.35 and contrast to 0.12. Now, I want to mix these two noises together. Press space, blend. Blend node does exactly what it says. It blends two inputs together. You can adjust opacity for the blending intensity on the right panel. Let's plug our bottom node into the background and the top one into the foreground. I will leave our blending mode to copy. Copy mode is basically gluing the foreground on top of the background. I think the foreground took away our background too much, so I'm going to decrease my opacity to 0.8. I am also going to plug our background into the opacity input. Opacity is for blending with a mask. Now I think that's a little bit better. Right. As you see in the 3D view, it didn't update our information. That's because we have to plug blend output to the height and normal map. Let's plug into the 2D transformation node we created earlier. For the normal map, we actually need to use normal filter to compute the normal from grayscale. Bring up our menu, and it's right here. Or you can press on the little top icon here. The information is very light here. We can increase this by double-clicking on Normal Filter. I will put 15 for intensity. Great. Now, I want to change our preview model to a plane so that we can have a better viewing. We can do this by clicking Scene in our 3D view. High-res plane. This looks much better. We can also adjust the light direction by holding the right mouse button, Shift, Control, and move across in the 3D view here.
All right, we can see our normal information here, but our height map is not quite showing. As you can see, it's flat. What we can do here is to enable the tessellation. In the 3D view, click on Materials, Default, Definitions. I am using metallic and roughness, so I'm going to click on that. And finally, tessellation. I'm going to crank up the tessellation factor to 16 and 4 for the scale. We can adjust this as we go. I will use this setting for now. I want to point out that tessellation can be expensive in real time, but I think it's a good practice for our project.
Let's continue by adding extra details. Instead of searching in the menu bar, I will find our noise generator in the library panel. You can have a better preview of all the noise generators here. Type Cloud. Let's grab Clouds 1 and blend this together. Double-click on the Blend node we created. This allows the next node we click on automatically connected to the selected node. Let's get our Blend node. You can use the previous way I showed you by grabbing it from the menu, but I will bring it in from the top bar this time. As you can see, it automatically connected as we expected, but our information in both 2D and 3D view disappeared. That is because we haven't hooked our Clouds 1 into the foreground. Let's set our blending mode to Soft Light and decrease the opacity to 0.77. This mode produces a slightly lighter or darker result depending on the brightness of the foreground. Our map appeared black again with the new information updated. Fantastic! This will be our base shape. I think we have a decent start. Let's save this package. Next up, I'm going to work on micro details. Feel free to skip ahead if you're not interested. Okay, I will start with a smaller shape again. Let's grab Clouds 2. We will need 2 of them. Copy and paste it here. Double-click on one of the nodes. We can adjust the values on the right bottom panel, and I'm going to leave the scale as it is, but I will change the disorder to my liking. 0.72 for my case again. Experiment with the settings for your own result. For the other cloud node, I will set the scale to 2 and the disorder to 0.25 because we want a bit of variation. I'm going to blend this together. Change the blending mode to Multiply. This will multiply the background value to the foreground. The result is always equal or darker. All right, now I think the detail from the cloud map is a little bit too strong for my taste. Double-click on the Blend node. I can come over to the Opacity and adjust to my liking. I will leave it to 0.53 for now. Let's reroute out our connection so we can see it on the preview. Okay, search Cloud again. Since we used Cloud 2 already, so I am going to choose the other 2 generators. Drag Cloud 1 and 3 to our graph. I'm going to blend in a lighter information first, so that's Cloud 3 it is. Let's get our blend node. I'm just going to change the disorder to introduce small variation. I will also change the blending mode to Overlay. What this mode is essentially a combination of multiply and screen mode. If the value of the lower layer pixel is below 0.5, multiply blending will be placed, and if it's higher than 0.5, screen blending will be set. I chose this blending mode because I tested all of the options before I recorded this tutorial. I highly recommend you go through all the modes and see which fits into your material. You can click on the options to open up the list menu and click it again to close it. Now press down or up arrow key. As you can see, you're able to toggle this back and forth, which can be very handy. All right, let's copy our previous blend node with the overlay mode setting in it. Delete all of the connection. Let's hook our last blend node output to the new blend node input. I'm going to make the connection for the Clouds 1. Also, I will be adjusting the disorder for variation, just like we did for the other maps. The result we get here is a bit too harsh. Decreasing the opacity will definitely help. 0.6 looks fine for now. Great. Let's move our notes a bit further so we can have space to work with. My goal for the next few passes is to wash down our map a little bit, as it's a bit intense and noisy at the moment. I will use black and white spots 3 here. Let's make 2 passes with this note. Copy this. Okay, we're going to repeat the blending process. Select the previous blend node, add a new blend node, and connect our first black and white spots 3. Change the blending mode to Multiply. Again, this will multiply the background value to the foreground. This is a bit too strong. Let's decrease the opacity to 0.67. Since we will have the same noises, I'm going to change the scale to 3 and disorder to 0.45. Then I will be doing the same thing with the other noise, but I'm not going to change any of the settings at this time. Grab a new blend node and plug in the noise generator. This time, I'm going to use switch mode. What this mode does is to blend the background and the foreground according to the opacity. When the values are closer to 0, information at the background will appear more. And when the values are closer to 1, our foreground will appear more. I will set this to 0.68. All right. I want to introduce another noise. Moisture noise. This is great for something that is wet. It creates moisture damage like noise. Set the scale to 3 and disorder to 0.11. I'm going to add histogram scan so that we can have a little control over this noise. Let's plug this in. I'm going to set position to 0.5 and 0.22 for the contrast. Now, blend this together so we can see the result. Set the blend mode to multiply. OK. Remember, before I added the black and white 3 noises, I pointed out that I was aiming to decrease intensity because it was too noisy. What I am going to do now is to compare our result. Let's reroute our last blend output to our second cloud's blend output. I'm going to zoom in to take a closer look. Press Ctrl-Z for redo into the last action so we can see the changes. Yeah, I think that's a little better in my opinion. We did lose some of the details here, but it's okay, we can bring it back again later on. Now we have our base of the micro details. I think it's a good time to start bringing in some much finer details like dirt and sand. Substance has quite a few dirt variations. I'm going to use dirt 4 and 5. Let's blend these two dirt together. First, I'm going to adjust the disorder because I'm not a big fan on how this is spreading. It's a minor tweak, but I think it will do the job. 0.41 for dirt 4 and 0.45 for dirt 5. Awesome. Now I want to remap the tone in both of these noises because there is way too much information right now. You can use histogram scan for that, but I'm going to use levels node this time. I'm going to need 2 of them. Let's hook up both to the input. Click our top levels. What I'm doing here is to take away most of the mid-level values. You can also click on this values icon to adjust it in a number form. I'm going to set this around 0.16. For our bottom dirt, we will adjust the mid and low values. Let's push this back a little bit. You know what? Why don't we adjust this in the Values tab as well? So 0.38 for low values and around 0.36 for the mid values. Great. Let's blend this in together. Dirt 5 is going to be the background. Dirt 4 for the foreground. And I'm going to set the blending mode to Add Linear Dodge. Add Linear Dodge produces similar but stronger results than screen mode. This blending mode will add the foreground input value to the background. It is way too strong right now, so I will decrease this to 0.05. Okay, let's blend this in with our micro base. Set the blend mode to Add Linear Dodge. Now, this is way too harsh, so let's turn the opacity down to 0.48. I think that's a little better, but it's still too intense. I'm going to add another level node to control our blended dirt values. Select the connection between the blend and grab a level. I will lower our low and mid values again. Push our mid values way back. Here are my values. 0.30 for low and 0.81 for the mid. Connect this to the 2D transformation tool so we can preview it. If you look closely in the 3D view, you will notice these little spikes. I will leave it for now because I want to do a few more cloud passes at the end. That might solve our problem here. I'm going to move this back so that we can have space to work with. Let's add a black and white spot 3 and histogram scan to lower the overall values. I will set the position to 0.27. Blend this together. Set the blending mode to multiply and lower the intensity to 0.18. Now, I want to create a mask to fill in much finer details. I'm going to get our favorite node, Cloud 2. Set the disorder to 0.3. Let's add levels to control the values, and I will only be tweaking the mid values this time. I will leave it around there. I'm going to get a histogram scan as well, 0.42 for position and 0.4 for contrast. All right, I'm going to grab black and white spots 1 to blend with the clouds 2. I will also be using a histogram scan to control our map. I want very light information here, so that I will set our position to 0.04 and 0.17 for contrast. Great. Let's blend this in. Plug the black and white spots in the background and cloud 2 in the foreground. Set this to max lighten. This mode will choose the higher value between the background and the foreground. I'm going to decrease the opacity to 0.67. Okay, I think it is time to preview our mask. Let's blend this into our micro details and set the blend mode to subtract. This will take away the foreground values from the pixel in the background. If the result of the subtraction is lower than 0, our result will become black, which is what is happening here. Now that I'm happy with my mask, I'm going to add one last pass for the micro details. What I'm going to do is to fill in the mask and other areas with much gritty detail. A mask allows us to have control with where the area we want to be filled in. Let's grab clouds 1 and 3. Blend this together in soft light mode and blend this to our micro map. Set this to screen and adjust the opacity to 0.61. All right, let's take a closer look here. This is the area we masked, and as we expected, it fills in much finer detail. Also, you can see height differences here that definitely added a little more character to it. Great. I think I'm happy with our micro dirt now. Let's make our connection with our base that we created. Base to the background, micro detail to the foreground. Change the blending mode to soft light and adjust the opacity to 0.87. Let's zoom in our material to have a closer look. You can toggle the connection back and forth to see the difference. Fantastic! Now that we've finished our micro details, let's get into our small details. I'm going to grab black and white spots 1 for the noise, and a histogram scan and levels for controls. Let's change the disorder to 0.45 and 2 for roughness. What roughness does is it blends between low and high frequency details. Let's hook our noise to the histogram scan and crank up the position to 0.48. Now this is way too noisy for me, so I'm going to make our connections to the levels and adjust the mid-level to here, 0.68. All right, let's blend this to our graph. Set the blending mode to screen and decrease the opacity to 0.69. Let's see what we added. Okay, I will add one more pass, then we will move on to the medium detail. I'm going to use black and white spots 1 and 3. Let's work on spots 1 first. Adjust the disorder to 0.32 and 1.66 for the roughness. Now, you can change the scale here, but I'm not going to do that because I'm happy with this pattern. But I want to increase the tiling. I'm going to use Transformation 2D. This node allows you to move, scale, and rotate the input information. What I'm going to do is to divide this twice, and you will see our tiling increased. If you want to do the opposite, you can scale the tiling by pressing ×2. Let's grab a histogram scan and levels for the controls. Copy that because we need it for our black and white spots 3 as well. All right, I'm going to make the connection here. What I'm trying to get here is a subtle information. 0.35 will be fine. We will adjust a little more in the levels node. Okay, first of all, I will adjust the white first. Again, you can change this in the Values tab. 0.46 will be fine for now. Let's adjust our low level. 0.22 looks good. And also our mid levels. 0.3 seems fine. Great. Let's do the same thing for black and white spots 3. Hook our noise generator to the histogram scan and the levels. I'm going to change the scale to 5 this time. And for the disorder, I will set it to 0.09 for variation. For the histogram scan, I will set the position to 0.16. Now, I am not a huge fan of this patch of noise here. That is when our levels node come in handy. We will do the same thing as our last level node by decreasing our white first. 0.38 looks fine to me. This time, instead of adjusting the low level, I will slightly increase our mid levels to 0.52, so we can have a little breakdown between the noises. All right, let's blend this together. Spots 3 for the background and spots 1 for our foreground, and set this to Add Linear Dodge. For opacity, I will decrease it to 0.44. Now, I think our result is a bit too noisy. What we can do here is to blur it. I'm going to grab Slope, Blur, Grayscale. This is similar to Directional Warp. What this node does is it will do a high-quality blur based on our slope input. Slope map determines the angle of the direction and the anisotropy. I usually avoid using harsh transitions noise for the slope map because it might give us a funky result. I'm going to use Clouds 2 this time. Make our connection into the slope input, plug the blended black and white noise into the slope blur grayscale. Okay, let's increase the amount of samples to 32 and decrease the intensity way down. 0.03 looks great. And now we will blend this with our base map. Let's plug this in. Decrease the opacity way down. I'm happy with 0.24. Great. Why don't we compare our results? Let's reroute the connections to the previous node. Nice. I like it. Now that we've finished the small detail, let's go ahead and move on to some medium detail. What I'm trying to get here is kind of like adding some extra oomph, if that makes sense. I will create a shape and tile it across the map. I was actually trying to create a rock shape for another project, and I want to know how it would look on this project. I made a little tweak, and it gave me a decent result. What I'm trying to say here is to experiment with your own project. There are tons of possibilities, and happy accidents might happen. Anyways, let's create our medium shape. Let's grab the shape generator And this is a very powerful node. It generates a variety of shapes. You can see all of it in the Pattern tab. I will use the square for this project. Scale this down to 0.73. All right, what I'm going to do next is to bevel the edge. Type Bevel on the menu. Plug this in. I'm going to decrease the distance to -0.37. Nice. Now our shape is very boxy, and we don't want that. Let's add a directional warp to break it up. Plug our height into the input. Directional warp will warp the input information in the direction based on the intensity input. I'm going to use plasma for our intensity input. Plasma noise came with 32 on the scale by default, and that is way too large for us. Let's decrease this down to 4. And change our disorder to 0.43. Now, you will see that the changes are very subtle. That is because we need to change the warp intensity. I'm going to set this for 80. You can also change the warp angle. I will leave it to 25 degrees. Let's warp this again to give the edge a bit more character. Plug this in. I'm going to use Grunge Map 5. I won't be tweaking the settings here, but I am going to add a transformation 2D to rotate and scale the map. I want our detail in the edges going in the horizontal direction, so I will rotate this 90 degrees. You can snap the rotation by holding Shift. Let's plug this in so we can view the result. The result is too harsh for my liking. I'm going to scale up the intensity input by pressing ×2 twice. OK. Now that we're happy with the intensity input, I'm going to change the warp angle to -169 degrees. Great. For our next two passes, I will be adding gradient details on the shape. I'm going to use Fractal Sum 3 for my first pass. Again, the noise is way too large here. Let's use a transformation 2D node and scale this by pressing ×2 4 times. OK, let's blend this. Plug our directional warp to the background and the Fractal Sum 3 to the foreground. Set Subtract for the blending mode and decrease the opacity to 0.6. Awesome. For our second pass, we will simply use a gradient linear map. I'm going to choose number 1. Let's add a blend node. Make the connection and change it to multiply. OK, I'm not entirely happy with the result yet. Why don't we create 2 more warp passes? Let's grab a directional warp. Plug this into the input. And this time, I will use Grunge Map 1. We will repeat the process, grab a transformational 2D, and scale this up for 3 times. I'm not a big fan with this harsh information here. Let's adjust our X offset to 0.29. Let's blur this with a directional blur. I will set the intensity to 3.47. Let's hook this up. For the directional warp intensity, I will set it to 17. Great. I'm going to add an auto level to brighten up our shape a bit. We can do this by clicking on the second icon on our parameters panel. I'm going to bring the mid-level down slightly as well. Nice. That brought back our shape a little bit. All right, for our second warp pass, I'm going to use Grunge Map 10. Now, I don't like the cracks here. It might be great for a bark material, but might not be suitable for this project. I will take this away by increasing the crack slider. 0.86 looks fine to me. OK, we will also be scaling this map up. I'm going to times this 3 times. Let's also adjust our offset here. 0.22 for Y, and I'm going to just go slightly change our X values to minus 0.02. Let's directional warp this. Make our connections here first. I will change our angle to here. I like these little crumbs here. Anyways, let's add a level node to lighten our edges. I will adjust the low values first. 0.2 feels good. Next, our high values. 0.83 looks fine. And finally, our mid-level to 0.41. All right, now that we have our base here, I want to create a little more details. I will do that by creating another version of the shape and blend it together afterwards. For this version, I'm looking for a much destroyed shape. Let's go back to our shape here. Grab a directional warp. I'm going to start with the version with a gradient. Plug this into the input. I will warp it with plasma noise. Let's scale this down. It's too big right now. 9 looks fine. Plug this into the warp's intensity output. I'm going to increase the warp intensity to 3.58 and the warp angle to 163. I'm going to subtract this with the base shape for getting the damage I want. Grab a blend node. Plug the new shape into the foreground and the base into the background. Change the blending mode to subtract. Now you can see it chipped away the area here, and this is what we want. It breaks down the shape, but at the same time, it kept the primary form. Great. Let's add a level. I'm going to brighten the highlight. Okay. Now I want to sharpen the edge a little bit. Let's grab a sharpen node, connect it, and increase the intensity to 1.5. Now, I want to bring back the shape here and also tighten the edges. We can do that by blending two levels together. Let's plug this in. We will adjust the high level on the bottom one. This will bring back the shape. 0.6 looks fine. Our top level is for tightening the edges. I will adjust the low level first. 0.2 looks good. Next, the high values. I'm going to set it to 0.83. And finally, 0.31 for the mid-level. All right, now I'm going to blend this with subtract mode. Turn the opacity way down. 0.25 looks good. Let's blend this with our base shape now. Our base in the foreground and the destroyed version in the background. I'm going to change the blending mode to switch. And for the opacity, I will set it to 0.68. Great. Now we need the shape to match with the ground base. We can do this by blurring it with a cloud noise. I'm going to grab a slope blur grayscale and clouds 2. Change the cloud scale to 2. Disorder to 0.56. Let's plug this in. Crank up the sample to 32. Change the mode to max and decrease the intensity to 4.48. Now, I want to bring the edges value down a little bit. I'm going to be looking for a nice and smooth transition between the ground. I'm going to grab a level, push our mid-level up a bit. I will set it to 0.53. Now you can see the contrast much better. Great. I think it's time to tile it. Let's grab a tile generator. Plug it into the pattern input. If you're not familiar with the tile generator, I would say it is one of the most powerful nodes in Designer. You can create almost any kind of pattern, and I found it great for creating bricks patterns. I will use this to tile the shape across our ground here. Let's change the pattern to image input first. Now our shape will display in the generator. I'm going to decrease the X amount to 6 and the Y amount to 5. In the Pattern tab, I will adjust the rotation random to 0.84 and symmetry random to 0.52. This will give us a good variation to start with. Let's go down to the Size tab. I want some of our shapes rectangular and some are squares. We can do that by changing the horizontal size to 0.54 and vertical to 0.52. Interstice XY will only affect the seam between the shapes. I'm going to turn X to 0.11, random to 0.2. For intersect Y, I will adjust it to 0.16 and random to 0.31. Now we can see there are squares and rectangles across the generator. Great. Why don't we change our position? I will set the offset to 0.61. This will offset the entire pattern. Offset random randomizes the offset. Let's set it to 0.5. Offset random seed will change the seed based on the offsetting random. I'm going to set this to 612. Let's change the position random as well. 0.43 for the X random, 0.23 for the Y random. The global offset will shift the entire result over X and Y axes. Let's set X to 0.44, Y to 0.2. OK. The rotation is pretty self-explanatory. It will perform a rotation to all the patterns. I'm going to set it to 59 degrees. 0.89 for the randomize, because we don't want the same angle of the rotation in every shape. Let's go ahead and adjust the luminance random to 1. That will induce some contrast variation. OK, I think our tile is a bit too busy right now. I am going to mask it out by 0.3 and change the blending mode to max. I will also be decreasing the global opacity down to 0.36. I think our shapes are too small right now. I'm going to go back to the Size panel and scale this to 2. Adjust the scale random a little bit and the scale random seed to 502. Fantastic. Now that we have our medium detail, let's blend it with our base. Hook our tiled shape to the foreground and set it to Add Linear Dodge. Let's compare the result. This is before and this is after. As you can see, it added an extra crease and raised the height in some areas. I found this extra bump in my references. I think it gave the mud a nice touch. Now let's move on to the last part of our height map, pebbles. Rocks and pebbles are always fun to work with. I'm going to start this with a tile sampler. This is a little more complex version of Tile Generator. The main difference is there are 7 different map slots here, but the generator does not. We can control scale, rotation, size, position, etc. I won't be using any of it right now, but we will use it later on while tiling the pebbles. All right, since I am working on pebbles, I will be looking for something that is round. I'm going to use paraboloid for the pattern. The transitions in the shape are perfect for pebbles. We're going to create 4 different rocks and tile it across to the ground. Let's decrease our X and Y amount down to 2. This will give us a result of 4 paraboloids.
Okay, let's create some variation first. I'm going to push the size random y to 0.87 and x to 0.11. Adjust the scale a little bit to 0.83 and scale random to 0.22. Okay, let's adjust the rotation. Rotation random to 0.66. Now I want to create some edges for our rocks. We can do that by blending with a cell generator. I'm going to use Cell 1. Change the blending mode to subtract and decrease the opacity to 0.46. Okay, you can see here our rocks have too much information. We can fix this by scaling down the cell's generator. I'm going to turn it down to 10 and the disorder to 0.57. Now I want to move the range of the edge out slightly. We can do that by using histogram range. This filter can reduce or move the range of the transitions. Range parameter determine how much to reduce the range down. I will set that to 0.89. The position is for offsetting the range reduction. I'm going to set it to 0.57. Let's tighten the edges and change the background to black again. I'm going to grab a level, plug it into the base of our rocks. What I'm trying to get here is kind of like a mask. We can do that by setting the low and high values to 0. Blend this together with the multiply blending mode. Let's see the differences. Great! The range of the edges are moving out as we wanted. Now I want to add a stronger gradient to our rocks so that we can have a little more characteristic. Instead of blending it with a gradient, I'm going to use flood fill this time. This effect will add much more variation to our shapes. Connect this to the levels. Before we blend this to the base shapes, we need to convert this back to the grayscale gradient. We can do that with Flood Fill to Gradient node. Let's plug it into the Flood Fill slot. I'm going to change the angle to -61, angle variation to 0.58. Multiply by bounding box size means it will scale the linear effect by each of the shape's own bounding box size. I'm going to set this to 0.28. All right, let's blend this back to the base. I'm going to set the blend mode to Min Darken. Min Darken will pick the lower value between the foreground and the background. As you can see, the gradient chipped away some parts of our rocks. It added more features to it. Nice. Now I want to chip away the rocks a bit more. Let's add another Flood Fill to Gradient. Plug this into the Flood Fill. We'll need to use different values in the parameters. Our last angle degrees were -61. I'm going to put -502 for this gradient. Our last angle variation was 0.58. I will set this one to 0.41. Bounding box size to 0.21. We can also control the gradient with the slope input. I'm going to grab Clouds 2, plug it into the slope input. Now let's click the gradient and adjust the slope image input. I'm going to set it to 0.41, the intensity to 0.2. Let's adjust the random seed to 7. All right, let's blend this together.
I'm going to change the blend mode to min darken. This will chip away the shape based on the gradient. Okay, this is what we have right now. I want to exaggerate the transition around the edges. We can achieve that by adding a bevel. I'm going to plug in the mask that we created earlier to the input. Let's decrease the distance as it's way too intense right now. I'm going to set it to -0.06. Now let's blend this with the multiply mode. I'm going to plug the height output from the bevel node to the foreground. Okay, this is not exactly what I'm looking for. I want a smoother transition. We can fix this by decreasing the opacity in the blend node. Let's set it to 0.45. Great. Now I want to create some tiny jagged details for our pebbles here. What I'm going to do is to get a slope blur grayscale, turn the sample to 32, and plug in our Clouds 2 maps here to the slope input. Connect our shape to the grayscale. I'm going to change the mode to min and decrease the intensity to 3.35. Okay, our slope information is too busy right now. We can fix it by scaling the Clouds map down with a 2D transformation node. Remember, times 2 is scaling down and divided by 2 is scaling up. Let's scale it down by 3 times. All right, I think this is still a little bit harsh. I'm going to blend this back to the base shape. I will set the blend mode to multiply, opacity to 0.92. Great. You can spend a bit more time on the pebbles, but I will leave it here. Let's tile this across the ground by using the tile sampler. I'm going to change the pattern to pattern input so that we can plug in our shape. By the way, guys, I learned this method from Daniel Theiger. You should definitely look him up. I will link his work in the description below. All right, so what I want to achieve here is to plug 4 of our pebbles into the tile sampler individually. We can do that by cutting the shape with Transformation 2D node. Before we do that, we can see our tile sampler has only one pattern input slot. We have 4 shapes to plug in, so we will need 4 of the slots. What we can do is to increase the pattern input number. Let's input 4. Now we can see 3 more slots appeared, and that's what we wanted. Perfect. Now we have that sorted, let's get into cutting out the shapes. Let's grab the 2D transformation node. Since we don't want to tile it here, we can disable it by going to Tiling Mode Option. And we will see this little icon. Click on it and change it to Absolute. Now, open up the Options bar and choose No Tiling. Copy and paste this 3 times because we will need 4 of them. Let's reorganize a bit. We want to keep our graph clean and tidy so that we can have easy access to all of the components. Now I'm going to plug in our shapes into all of the 2D transformation nodes. For the first one, I will be cutting the bottom right first. We can do this by setting the offset to 0.25 on both the X and Y axis. Now, scale it up by pressing ×2. Great. Now we will cut out the top left one by offsetting X and Y to -0.25 this time. I'm going to scale it up one more time like the previous one. For the bottom left one, I will set the x-axis to -0.25 and y to 0.25. Remember to scale it up. Okay, for the last one we will do the opposite. Y to -0.25 and x to 0.25.
Again, scale it up. Now we have all of the shapes cut out individually. I will start plugging all of it into the shape pattern of our tile sampler. We can see 4 of the shapes, our tile, across the sampler here before we adjust any settings. I want to add a scale map for scaling controls purposes. Let's grab a Perlin noise, set the scale to 4. I'm going to use histogram scan to adjust the values, set position to 0.5 and contrast to 0.13. OK. Let's make the connection to the scale map input. Now, if you go to Tile Sampler Properties, scroll down to the size parameters and adjust the Scale Map Multiplier. You can see it blend in effect based on the scale map. I'm just going to scale this up so you guys can see it better. So this is set to 0 when you start to adjust the slider. You will see it takes in effect. If we look at it on the smaller area here and go back to the scale map, you can see it is the darker area creating the effect. If you disconnect the scale map and adjust the scale map multiplier, it will essentially just scale everything smaller. Anyways, let's plug this back into the scale map input. The first thing I'm going to adjust in the tile sampler is the size. Scroll down to the size parameters. Set 3 to the scale. Then, scale map multiplier to 0.76. Scale random to 1. Now I'm going to push the size variation a bit more. I'm going to change the x-axis size to 1.5 and for the size random in the x-axis to 0.5. Now I think some of the pebbles are way too big, and I want a lot more to be tiling across the ground. We can fix these two issues by changing the amount of the parameters. I will change x-axis to 50 and y to 51. OK, let's adjust the position. I will set the position random to 3.47. The offset will shift the tile. Depending on the offset type, I'm going to set it to 0.36. The global offset will shift the whole tile on both x and y axis. I set x to 0.19 and y to 0.13, and I will leave the other options as it is. All right, let's move on to the rotation. I'm going to change the angle degrees to -149. Rotation random are pretty self-explanatory. It randomizes the tile position. Let's crank it up to 1. I'm not going to adjust anything on the rotation map multiplier. For the vector map multiplier, I will set it to 0.24. You can also add a grayscale map for it. Just plug into the vector map slot. It is the same workflow in the scale map. We can also control the rotation random under the pattern properties. I will push the randomize to 1. Symmetry random determines how many tiles should be randomly flipped, and it is based on the mode we set here. I will set it to 0.28. Great. All right, color properties. This is the final adjustment we are going to make in the tile sampler. I'm going to change the blending mode to Add Sub, so pebbles will be stacking on top of each other instead of sticking to one another. Adjust the color to 219 so the values will decrease a little bit. Color parameterization mode is for setting how the color randomization is presented. You can experiment with the options. I'm going to set mine to Scale. Color parameterization multiplier is for blending in the mode we previously assigned. I'm going to crank it up to 1. Now, I just want to make one last adjustment. Let's go back to the top properties here and change the random seed to 3. This is just a personal preference. You don't have to copy the exact same thing. All right, I think it's a good time to preview our pebbles. Let's blend this in with our ground. The ground shape will be in the background, and the pebbles will be in the foreground. Let's change the blending mode to Add Linear Dodge. As we see, our pebbles are way too harsh and spiky. We can fix this by going back to the tile sampler, scroll down to the color properties. I will adjust the global opacity. This option will set the global values of the tile. I'm going to push it down to 0.27. Let's compare our result. This is before, and this is after we adjusted the global opacity. Okay, that washed out almost all of the pebbles. I'm going to brighten our values by adding an Auto Levels node to the Bevel Blend Pass. Awesome! Now that's the end of the height map creations. Great job! Before we work on the color map, I want to create the Ambient Occlusion Map. An AO map creates soft shadowing. It's a method to provide information on how high or low indirect light should be shining on any specific area of a surface. All right, we need to create an AO output first. I'm going to copy our height map output. Double-click to select it. We can change the usage on the Properties panel here. Select Ambient Occlusion. I'm also going to change the label and identifier to Ambient Occlusion. Okay, now we need a filter to generate the AO map from the height map. Let's bring up the menu. Type Ambient. Click on the Ambient Occlusion filter. Okay, so our 3D view is not previewing the map. What we can do here is to hold right-click and drag the channel output to 3D view. Then select Ambient Occlusion. As we can see, our AO map has been created, but it is too harsh right now. We can fix this by adjusting the height depth and radius in the filter's parameters. Let's put 0.02 for height depth and 0.38 for radius. I'm also going to change the quality to 16 samples. This determines the quality level of samples. Now, I want to emphasize the pebbles. We can do this by grabbing another AO filter and plug into the Pebbles Tile Sampler. Let's change the height depth to 0.06 and radius to 0.01. Quality to 16 samples. Great. Let's blend this with the base AO. Base in the background and the pebbles on the foreground. Okay, the last I'm going to do is to change the blending mode to Min Darken. Let's compare the result. This is before we added the extra pebbles information, and this is after. Great. I think it brought up the pebbles by the soft shadows. Now let's move on to the color map. I'm going to create a simple base color first. Let's bring up the menu and add a gradient map. Plug it into the height map with pebbles. Now click on Gradient Editor. It will bring up this menu. All of the options are grayed out right now. That is because we need to add pins on the gradient. Great. Now we will be using Pick Gradient on the bottom right corner here. This allows you to drag on photos, and all the colors will be picked up to the gradient view here. So this is the gradient I picked from a reference I liked. If you want the same color as mine, you can pick my gradient by dragging across the video. Okay, let's plug this into the base color. Great, I like it. It's a very basic setup. We need to work a little bit more on the pebbles. Also, don't worry about the steep areas on the ground, because we will add puddles later on. Alright, let's move on to the pebbles color. I'm going to add another gradient map and plug it into the pebbles. This time, I will add 2 extra pins by hand. Okay, for the first color, I will change it to white, because that is the background. Since our mud is on the wet side, rain or snow will soften the mud, and usually the mud will go over or cover the pebbles. So I will choose a brownish color for the second pin. You can copy this color by typing this number, or you can click or pick and pick on the video. Great. For the third color, I'm going to copy the last color. Click on the next pin and press Paste. Also, I'm going to change it to a slightly darker color. Let's push the pin closer to the previous pin. Alright, for the last pin, I will choose a grayish color and adjust the pin forward. Great! Now I want to exaggerate the color by blending in a uniform color. Let's choose a brown color, not too dark, not too light. Somewhere in the middle will be great. And I'm going to blend it with Multiply. Gradient map in the background and uniform color for the foreground. Now we can see there's a problem. The uniform color is blending with the pebbles background as well. That is when the opacity slot comes in handy. What we will do is to create a mask with a level node. Plug the level into the pebbles. The black color is the place where it will be masked out. You can see there's this grayish information, and we don't want that. We just want black and white. I'm going to push my high value all the way down. Now we have a mask that is sharpened. Great. To summarize what opacity does is it essentially tells the blend to take away the black area from the level node, which is the background of the pebbles in our case. Okay, let's blend the pebbles color to the ground in the background and pebbles on the foreground, and change the blending mode to Multiply. Let's preview this by connecting to the output. Okay, our pebbles are way too intense. I'm going to decrease the opacity to 0.3. That is much better. Fantastic, we're almost there. We will add one last thing, and that is the puddles. This is a super easy way. Bring up the menu and type Water. Click on the water level. This is an all-in-one effect for adding water level. You will need a great height map to get the most out of it. It doesn't work for every single project, but I think it gave me a great result for this one. So we can see all of the channels input are listed here. Let's reroute all of it. First, base color. Take our base color output and connect it to the water level's base color. Then, we will do the same for the normal map. Let's plug the height map to the roughness. Okay, for metallic, we are actually going to turn it off. Go to the parameters of the water level and press False in metallic. And finally, connect our height and AO map. Great! Let's connect all of the output to the channels. Alright, now we can see the water is added. Let's make some adjustments. Scroll down to the water level parameters. I'm going to leave the water level for now. Water darkness is to set the transparency of the water. I want it to be darker, so I'm going to set it to 0.7. Let's zoom in for edges wetness. It determines how wet the edges should look. It's a bit too wet for me right now. I'm going to decrease it to 0.55. Edge's wetness distance is for setting how far the edge's wetness will reach. I want the whole ground to be wet, so I will set it in a high value. 0.8 looks good. Depth blur amount is for determining how much to blur based on depth below water. You will see the changes a little bit better in the 2D view. Let's set it to 0.72. The opacity is for how much blur is being blended. Let's set it for 0.8. Okay? Sludge depth is for setting when does it start showing up. I'm going to set it for 0.63. Sludge opacity is for setting the global opacity of the effect. Let's set it for 0.86. Frost is for creating an icy effect. I really like this effect, so I'm going to set 0.39 for it. You don't have to add it if that's not what you're looking for. Feel free to skip it out. Let's increase the frost cracks. I want it to be a bit more visible. 0.65 looks good. All right. Now, I'm not happy with the water level. Instead of adjusting it in the water level slider, I'm going to add a mask to the input slot. I'm going to use Clouds 2. Let's change the disorder to 0.52. Plug it in. Great, that's much better. Now I think the base color is too dark. Let's add an HSL for adjusting the values. I'm going to decrease a tiny bit in the hues value. 0.4952. Okay, let's increase the saturation to 0.52. And finally, brighten the lightness to 0.53. Awesome! Well done, you guys. Big props to you for making it this far. Send me all of your results on Twitter. I would love to see them. Make sure you check out the PDF and the project file. It'll definitely help out the channel and enable me to create more contents like this. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this tutorial, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you next week with this moss tutorial.